Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales News Buzz.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We haven't been posting for a while, but here we are again with another episode of the News Buzz series. We're going to cover topics related to the presidential elections in Iran and in the US. And what else, Chris?
We'll talk about just general things in the news.
Bless you. So let's start with Biden.
Okay. So as everyone has probably seen, Biden was at the NATO summit to celebrate an anniversary of their warmongering, and he just made a complete fool of himself. He introduced Zelensky as Putin and said some derogatory thing about Stoltenberg's wife. Said all sorts of things. It was obvious that he's totally demented. I think it's clear that he's been that way for a while, and now the powers that be are just wanting to unveil the curtain for some new power grab. I'm not sure what that is, but what do you think about it?
Well, watching the presidential debates and just Biden talking and comparing that with Iran, it's just unbelievable how. I mean, I can't imagine how people are going to vote for Biden or Trump. I mean, it's looking from outside, it doesn't really make a big difference for example, Iranians, if it's Biden or Trump, even though inside the country everyone is saying that, oh, if Trump becomes the president, there are going to be more sanctions, but practically there's never been a huge difference between a Democratic president or a Republican president. But this time, I mean, Trump and Biden are, I think, probably the craziest candidates we have ever seen. Would you say that's correct?
Well, I mean, considering who ran last time, it's probably about the same. But we're just constantly affronted by the lack of skilled candidates. I think that's the interesting thing that most people probably in the U.S. aren't aware of when it comes to the comparison to the Iranian elections, is that the first round of elections involved 6 candidates, 3 of which were PhDs, and the other 3 were medical doctors. So, and now the runoff was between a PhD and an MD, and it was won by a cardiologist who's also a war veteran and has lost part of his leg in the war against Saddam Hussein, when Saddam Hussein was an ally of the U.S.
That's the other candidates. The candidate that lost. I mean, both of them fought in the war against Saddam and the U.S.-backed war on Iran. But
so they're both veterans.
But the one who won had fought, but the one who lost had even lost a leg during fighting in the war. Yeah.
Okay. Those are the fact that they're both veterans.
I mean, it doesn't make it. Yeah.
Exceeds anything that we've had as president candidate material in the U.S. If we had people who actually suffered and understood the evils of war, we would have a much less militaristic policies, because we just have these kind of silver spoon fed candidates that have no real experience with evil or bloodshed, and so or skilled in any way or intellectual in any way. This is the difference. We have to anyone looking at from the outside, it's obvious the U.S. is like a banana republic. Our presidents don't represent the people; they represent the power. Whereas in Iran, the presidents represent the people. So this, derogatory propaganda against the Iranian government or the Iranian culture is really shocking when you actually analyze it in comparison to what's available in the U.S. to us in terms of free and fair elections. That's another thing. Like, the Iranian election system uses paper and pen and is counted in the open. the American elections used to be prior to 9/11. Our election systems were all like that. There were paper. I mean, we had a period of CHAD-based punch cards, but before that, I guess we had almost all was just handwritten and then counted by a group of volunteers, who were then had another volunteer group who monitored their counting. So you had like two groups of people counting. Yeah, and that's how they do it in France. And France gets their elections results quicker than we do. So like it's obvious that our system is in place to give the appearance of efficiency or the appearance of high technology, but it's actually there for the manipulation of the votes.
Yeah, and it's ironic how the U.S. blames or accuses Iran of not having a fair and free election. But in Iran, it's also interesting how the people who are who supervise both the ballot counting and the voting process are volunteers from just ordinary people. And you can have your friends or your neighbors or your relatives or I don't know, your teacher just register for being a supervisor at a polling station, and they're local people who know from both sides, and different candidates have their own representatives of monitoring the counting of the ballots and everything. And so I think that's also something important. And the other thing that we have been talking about with regards to a comparison of the election system here, or just the political system here and in the US, is that, before the election results, because there was the election went for a second round, and there was a very close competition between the two main candidates. So people were saying that the fans of the candidate that lost the election were worried that the country would be taken over with the politicians that are on the other side or with the other party. But in fact, the parliament at the moment, which just had a new election a few months ago and has elected new members. The election was actually in March. The parliament is now majority from the Principalist Party. And it's the parliament that has to confirm and approve the cabinet members. So the president is going to introduce his choices of the cabinet to the parliament, and the parliament has to vote for them. So there's always like these forces play together to make a balance between the two parties. Sometimes both the parliament and the presidency is at the hands of one candidate, like the 3 years ago. Sometimes it's not, and whenever it's not, you usually expect more, maybe kind of more competition or tension, because it may take a longer time for the parliament to approve the president's choice of cabinet members. But apart from that, you're always sure that there are different opinions involved in the system, and it's not only one party. And that's not something that happens in the US. So, for example, if you have Trump as the president, you always have to worry about the warmongers or the ultra. I mean, I think there's a Zionist influence that doesn't make a big difference between the two. But I mean, nobody is going to have an opinion on who Trump chooses as his administration, right?
Like John Bolton,
or
for
Biden.
Example. So John Bolton for
yeah.
And nobody could say no, even though John Bolton's almost universally despised. So it's like that sort of appointee process has a approval process in Iran to make sure that you don't get crazy individuals who might be there for political reasons. Because like, for example, like a lot of presidential candidates nominate their vice president as someone who is not very well liked to protect them from getting assassinated, because they're like, well, you want to assassinate me, here's Kamala Harris. So like that's yeah. So there's sometimes things that can happen politically that don't benefit the people of the nation. They're just there to like benefit the candidate themselves and actually are harmful to the society. So to have a body that vets choices and approves them or gives warnings about people is I think that's useful. I wish we had some way of doing that. It's kind of difficult to do that in this situation in the U.S. because we don't have like any source of moral focus. So there's no like way of determining what is good and what isn't. So when you have a government that's like based around a religion or something like that, there's a little bit more moral clarity, even though it can be exploited as well. But it's at least there's a focus where there isn't when you have a government that, I mean, like the U.S., where there's just sort of a amoral argument around legal issues. Like that's all you have to base it on.
Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to say about the Iranian election is something that I've been following on, especially Twitter, but on social media, that like accounts, like people who are pro-resistance and pro-Iran have been raising concerns, and other people asking me about who this new president-elect is, and if he's going to support Palestine, and how things are going to change, or if this is something to worry about. And I've seen people I would say kind of abusing a larger audience lack of knowledge of Farsi and saying things that are not really true, and portraying the president-elect as someone who can be pro-Israel, pro-West, when in fact, I mean, one of the first thing that he has done so far is sending a message to the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and saying that he will support Palestine. He's known as someone who's he has a different opinion in how to form diplomatic relations with other countries, and he has favored a return to the JCPOA, but actually the current government, the government of Shahid Raisi, was also working on possibilities of returning to the JCPOA, and it does not mean that Iran is going to just give any concessions to the West and not protect its national interests. Whether or not we agree with certain decisions, it does not mean that one candidate in Iran can actually be so pro-Israel, which is impossible, or pro-America even. But yes, he could be pro certain policies that are that would not just focus on, for example, forming alliances with the East, but also consider ways of negotiating with the West in order to lift sanctions. I mean, I'm not talking about whether or not this is a good policy or a bad policy, but you cannot say that this guy, for example, does not respect General Soleimani because he absolutely does, or this guy is not pro-Palestine or does not want to support Palestine because he does. And no matter who comes into power, the general policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran with regards to supporting the Palestinian cause and just protecting its national security does not really change.
Yeah, I think that's important to say also that the external military activities, especially ones engaged in like the fight against ISIS or the fight to secure the borders, I mean, that's carried out by the IRGC and they're separate from the political process. So I think people need to know that there's a big gulf there. It can be actually not always beneficial to people in Iran. They often criticize that the IRGC's extreme separation from the government, but it can be very useful too in situations like when your president may or may not have been assassinated. I wanted to say also that it's very interesting that the president elect. He hasn't been. When is he sworn in? Probably know that. When will he be the president?
I don't know the exact day. I should check
Soon.
that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Normally it would be September, but I think it's going to be sooner than that this year because
Yeah, it would make sense since
it was a snap election.
and there isn't current president. But
yeah.
his opponents, he invited him like the first day after the election results. He invited him to his office and said, "Hey, I want to hear your ideas too. Let's work together." So it's just like it's a totally different concept of how, like, here it's more of a, I don't know, it's more like a sports competition, or like a, I don't know, it's like not the actual goal of like running the country and taking care of people in civil society or whatever is not really part of the election hype and process here. So I would be shocking. It would be like almost un-American at this point to see a candidate invite his like competitor in to ask for his ideas. Like if you had Biden ask Trump to come into office to say, would I be open to hear your ideas to run the country, Mr. Trump? I mean, it's impossible. That just couldn't happen because the way like American brains are wired. Once you win, you totally ignore that evil man who you defeated. So it's like, it's such a childish way of like pursuing civil society and the improvement of civil society, where you just treat everything as if you're a 3-year-old. But that's how politics are in America. It is kind of strange to see the rest of the world, how America belittles like the Russian presidential elections or any of the actual like peer or almost peer competitors of the U.S. Are always belittled as these like oh, they don't know what they're doing, they're so pathetic or whatever. But in reality, when you see them, it's just so obvious that those are the adults in the room, and the U.S. is just increasingly becoming more demented and immature, and it's shocking because the level of violence that the U.S. can wield, and unlike in Iran, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. So we have a demented man who refers to others as the commander-in-chief, as he did in this NATO conference. He said, I've been talking to my commander-in-chief. It's like one of his weird quotes from the last from the NATO summit. It's like, who are you talking to then? You're the commander-in-chief. Yeah, so this mental patient is in charge of the most powerful destructive force on the earth. So it is no joke.
And imagine if you were a country always under threat like Iran is.
Yeah.
Like, that the security of the country would be totally jeopardized if that was the case. That's one reason that the military forces are kind of working separately, because even though we lost the president, that was very shocking, and it was not the first time that military official, government official was killed, or if he died, or if assassinated. We have had the experience of assassination, traitors, and everything. So this experience has, pushed Iran to organize the power relations inside the country in a way that is considered them like the most secure. So in terms of how the military works, and how we have a leader, and then the parliament, and the different governmental bodies that supervise each other. So there is not like, the power is not concentrated in the hands of just one person. There are different bodies that are playing a role.
But technically, it's not supposed to be in one person here. There's supposed to be congressional approval for any war action. But then after 9/11, that was done away with. So now you do have this idea of like executive privilege or executive authority to do all sorts of things. So like, as long as you don't use the word war, you can basically do whatever you want. So it's kind of scary that's where we're at. When you see Biden's level of just comprehension of reality. So I don't know, what else should we talk about?
I think that's about it. We can wrap it up. But before that, I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about the next election? Who do you think is going to win? Is Biden going to stay? And if he does, do you
I
think Trump
mean,
is going to be the next president?
I think it's possible, given all of the bizarre like psyops that we've been inundated with, and that are obviously meant to like sort of spank the mind of critical thinkers. Like, I think it's possible that they run Biden and they make Biden win, and then they make us accept that. I think that's a real possibility. That would be an extreme power grab, and it kind of just a domination of the psyche of Americans, sort of domesticating people's minds. If we're forced to accept that, I mean, we already were forced to accept that in the previous election, and so if it happens even worse this time to the obvious, the demented person that's running, yeah, it's possible. But I think more probable is that Trump wins. I mean, the only way I could see him not winning is if they run someone like Michelle Obama, and if she's run, they could be possibly the win, because they do have a lot of
Right.
class. Yeah, so I think it's possible that we have another,
especially
Obama
versus Trump. Yeah,
but they've not shown any interest in that, and Kamala Harris is not going to easily step down. I think she would love to run. So I think it's possible it would be a Kamala Trump race, which is insane. Trump would win that hands down. He'll win a Biden competitor hands down. I mean, he'd win all those just from a prison cell, so he doesn't even need to campaign to win those. So, yeah, it's going to be bizarre, and I think we're at a real risk of greater military escalation, because that's one of the only things I think that the White House would see as a way of retaining authority, be to become a wartime president, which is what conveniently happened to George W. Bush. He had a almost 20% like approval rating prior to 9/11, and then afterwards it went up to like 60 or 70%. So it was depending on the mendacity of the people planning things, they could create a scenario in which overnight Biden becomes very popular. So we'll see. It's hard to predict, but it's definitely not. It's definitely volatile. It's like one of the most volatile and disturbing, probably the most disturbing time for people who are politically aware. I mean, Biden was even like recorded saying in an interview that it's not my body that's a problem, it's my brain that said that. I mean, it's like in his like bizarre way where he's always constantly saying, not a joke, not a joke. That is definitely not a joke. Like when you say that, it's like,
yeah, the only time he made sense. Mm-hmm.
Another thing we should probably mention is that the Haaretz finally admitted that the Israeli government has used the quote unquote Hannibal directive to assassinate its own civilians out of convenience, so that it wouldn't have to like work hard to get them released as captives. They'd rather just kill them with using this law, which, as far as I can tell, is named after Hannibal Lecter, which is where you just kill people for convenience and fun in order to prevent them from becoming captives. And so they just slaughtered the majority of the people on October 7th. It looked like they were just slaughtered by Israel. And that's why all these cars were burned up, and there were these houses that were blown up, and it was blamed on Hamas, who were just carrying AK-47s and a few like small incendiary devices or grenades, whatever they could carry on their back. They couldn't have done the damage that was filmed. And then Israel like immediately dug a giant pit and buried all of the cars and all the evidence in a giant hole, so nobody could see it again. So it doesn't sound like something you would do if you were trying to like show, oh, how horrible Hamas is. They would want people to look at the terrible damage. Well, they deleted a lot of the pictures and they dumped a lot of it into a hole, similar to what happened to the buildings of 9/11, actually. So you do that when you want to kind of remove the evidence so that people can't pick around and be like, wait a minute, how would this like residue of Hellfire missiles been brought about by Hamas? But yeah, so that's important to know because the Gray Zone was on that story along with Electronic Intifada in the very beginning, and were suffered a lot of aggression by the propagandists.